On the night of April 2nd, 1502, inside the cold stone chambers of Ludlow Castle, a 15-year-old prince lay trembling beneath heavy blankets. His skin burned, his breath rattled, his pulse flickered like a dying candle. Outside his door, the servants whispered a single terrifying phrase: "The sweat is here." For 6 days, Arthur Tudor, heir to the English throne, symbol of hope for the newly born Tudor dynasty, fought a sickness that killed faster than daggers and more ruthlessly than war. Witnesses said the disease made the blood feel as if it were boiling inside the veins. Victims gasped for air, drowned in their own sweat, and died screaming that the heat was burning them alive from within. He was barely old enough to shave, barely old enough to rule, barely old enough to understand why God had chosen him as the firstborn son of a fragile dynasty still stained with the blood of civil war. And yet here he was, burning, fading, dying. Beside him sat Catherine of Aragon, his new bride. She was 16, newly married, newly hopeful, now watching her husband slip away helpless in the face of a sickness no doctor could name and no priest could pray away. She held his hand as his body convulsed. She whispered prayers he could no longer hear. She watched the sweat soak through the sheets until they clung to him like a shroud. Then quietly, Arthur Tudor took his final breath. A bride became a widow. A king lost his heir. A dynasty lost its future. And a chain reaction began that would reshape England, shatter the church, destroy queens, build empires, and ignite one of the most brutal reigns in European history. Because what died that night was not just a boy. What died was England's stability, Henry VII's sanity, Henry VIII's innocence, and the future the Tudors had been counting on. This is the secret tragedy no one talks about. If Arthur Tudor had lived even one more week, there would be no Henry VIII on the throne. No 6 wives, no executions, no Reformation, no Elizabeth I, no Anglican Church. All of it, every triumph, every death, every broken marriage began in those 6 days of fever. So what really killed Arthur Tudor was its sweating sickness, a political cover-up, a genetic curse, or something darker. A truth that Henry VII buried so deeply that historians still argue about it 5 centuries later. Tonight we uncover that truth. We follow the fever, the fear, the throne's trembling foundations. We reveal the death that rewrote history. But before we step into the darkness of Ludlow Castle, before we watch the empire crumble from the loss of one teenage boy, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because history is not shaped by kings. It is shaped by the moments when kings are lost. Sweating sickness was not like any illness England had seen before. It was the kind of disease that didn't just frighten physicians, it made them feel useless. The plague was predictable. It announced itself with swollen lumps and slow decay. Fevers were survivable. You could see them coming, fight them with broth herbs, prayers, and patience. But the sweat. It arrived like a whispered curse, slipping under doors and through keyholes, and killed like a divine punishment, swift and merciless, as if heaven itself had grown tired of the people below. It moved fast, too fast. A man could be laughing at breakfast, sharing jokes over roasted meat and warm ale, sweating by lunchtime, stripping off his clothes in panic as his skin burned dead before sunset. His cup still half full on the table, his footprints still fresh in the rushes on the floor. Its symptoms were a theater of horror, a performance no one wanted to watch, but no one could look away from. First came the shaking, violent trembling, as if the bones themselves were rejecting life joints, chattering so violently that teeth broke, hands spasming as if trying to claw their way out of the body. Then the heat and internal fire so intense that victims clawed at their own skin, leaving red streaks down their arms, begging to be thrown into cold water, thrashing, as if invisible flames were licking their nerves. Then the sweat, not a light sheen, but a flood. pouring from the body in sheets, soaking through linen, dripping onto the floor, turning bedding into a swamp of fever and salt. Some said you could smell the sickness in the room before you saw the patient, a sour metallic scent of fear and flesh. Then the terror, not simple fear, but an overwhelming sense of doom so strong that doctors wrote it was a sign the soul knew it was about to depart. Men who had never cried on battlefields now sobbed and clung to priests like children. They knew with a certainty that defied reason that they were about to die. All of this could unfold within hours. A sunrise of health, a midday of agony, a sunset of stillness. And once the sweating began, there was no stopping it. No tonic, no charm, no poultice, no relic. The disease laughed at human effort. The sweat killed nobles and peasants alike, sparing no rank, no gender, no age. It crept into castles as easily as cottages, knocked on the doors of great houses with the same indifference as it did on taverns. But the question historians still ask, in whispers even now, centuries later, is the one that echoes the loudest. Why did it strike Arthur Tudor, and why did it strike him first? Ludlow Castle had been a political nest for centuries. Princes were sent there to learn to govern. Judges held courts there. Dignitaries came and went with their retinues, bringing newsletters and unknowingly diseases. Clothes and linens were transported from other estates, washed in rivers, dried in open air, folded by hands that might have touched a dozen other households that week. The Welsh marches were humid, crowded, full of stagnant water and huddled villages. Air hung heavy in the valleys. Animals, people, insects, all living on top of one another. Conditions were perfect for disease. But why Arthur? Why the heir to the English throne? Why the boy groomed from birth to be king? Why the child Henry VII had spent half his reign protecting from rebels, pretenders, and political storms? Was it fate? Blind, cruel, indifferent fate? Was it chance, the random roll of a cosmic dice, or something darker? A truth quietly buried by a terrified king and a grieving court. A weakness in Arthur's body they never admitted. A miscalculation in sending a delicate boy into a dangerous climate. A political embarrassment that no one dared write down. To uncover that truth, we must do what history often refuses to do. We must slow down, step inside the castle walls, and follow Arthur into the last 6 days of his life. Arthur woke on the morning of March 27th, 1502, feeling wrong. Not sick, not feverish, just wrong. That was the most unsettling part. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden agony. Just a sense that something inside him had shifted out of place. He told his attendants that his chest felt tight, as if a hand were pressing down behind his heart, a dull weight that wouldn't lift. His breath came short and fast, not quite pain, not quite panic, but close enough to make him uncomfortable. He could not shake a growing sense of dread, a heaviness that did not belong to a boy of 15. Catherine of Aragon noticed immediately. She always watched him closely, not as a wife deeply in love yet, but as a young woman, trying to learn the man she had been tied to for the rest of her life. They had been married for only 5 months, barely enough time to know each other deeply, yet enough to recognize fear when it flickered behind his eyes. Arthur tried to act strong. He always had. Born during the last breaths of civil war, raised as a symbol of peace, groomed to embody the resurrection of the English monarchy, Arthur had never been allowed to show weakness. Every tutor, every priest, every noble reminded him that he was more than a boy. He was an emblem, a promise, a fragile banner in human form. But that first day, he could not hide the trembling in his hands. By noon, the sweating began. At first, it was just a dampness at his temples, a sheen across his forehead. Then it escalated. Servants rushed in with clothes, cold wine, and fresh linens. They opened shutters, then closed them again, unsure if air would help or harm. Doctors whispered to one another as the prince's pupils widened in terror. They recognized the pattern. They had seen this before. They knew what it meant. Sweating sickness had returned, and it had chosen the heir to the throne. By the second day, Arthur Tudor was no longer the elegant, refined young prince the kingdom adored. He was a boy, fighting for breath. His skin turned hot, unnaturally hot, the kind of heat that radiated even through layers of soaked blankets, the kind that made the air shimmer above his body, as if flames danced invisibly. Witnesses said his sweat dripped off the bed in rivulets, forming small puddles on the stones below, mixing with straw and dust until the floor beneath his bed looked like a bog. He cried that his blood felt like it was bubbling, like something was trying to boil its way out of his veins. Catherine stayed beside him, refusing to leave, even as her ladies tugged at her sleeves, pleading with her to rest, to protect herself, to think of her own future. She ignored them. She soaked towels in cold water and laid them on his forehead, wrung them out, replaced them again and again until her arms ached and her fingers wrinkled from the water. Doctors argued in the corner, their voices panicked but low, as if raising their volume might anger whatever invisible force had gripped the prince. Should they bleed him, purge him, wrap him tighter, strip him naked, force him to drink, let him rest? Every theory contradicted the last. Every treatment seemed wrong. Every remedy made him worse. The castle chaplain came to pray. He looked at Arthur once one quick assessing glance and immediately requested more candles. Not for healing, but for last rites. When word reached Henry VII in London, he froze. Henry VII, the cautious, shrewd, iron-nerved founder of the Tudor dynasty, felt the old terror return like a hand closing around his throat. The terror of Bosworth. The terror of exile. The terror of living 28 years knowing anyone could claim his throne, knowing he was a king built on hope and calculation, not ancient, unquestioned right. He had built his reign on control, calculation, caution. He had hoarded alliances, hoarded coins, hoarded peace like a man hoards air underwater. But Arthur was the one thing he could not control. He sent the best physicians. He sent prayers. He sent orders. Save him. But the sweat does not obey kings. Henry knew this illness. He had survived it as a young man. He had watched men die in minutes, collapsing in the middle of meals, screaming that their skin was on fire. He knew Arthur's chances were nearly zero. He knew it with the cold clarity of a man who has seen this demon before. And so, Henry VII did something he rarely allowed himself. He panicked. He walked the halls of Richmond Palace like a ghost, unable to sit, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything but the image of his firstborn son drowning in his own sweat. Every footstep echoed like a countdown. Every unopened letter felt like a blade. He watched the door waiting for the messenger who would break the world in half. Because if Arthur died, Henry knew exactly what it meant. All of England would burn again. On the fourth day, Arthur's mind began to slip. The fever climbed so high that he could barely recognize those around him. Faces blurred. Voices melted into meaningless sounds. He whispered strange things, words in Latin fragments of prayers, sentences that made no sense. Sometimes he thought he was already king, reaching out as if to touch a crown that wasn't there. Sometimes he begged for his mother, calling for comfort he hadn't needed since childhood. Sometimes he cried out that he was burning in hell, eyes wild back arched as if flames licked at his spine. Catherine held him still, kept him from scratching his own arms raw, pressed his shoulders down when his body convulsed in terror. She sponged the sweat from his face, even as it returned faster than she could wipe it away. Her ladies begged her to leave. If she stayed, she would fall ill too. If she fell ill, what would become of Spain's alliance? What would become of her family's hopes? What would become of her but Catherine, raised by Isabella of Castile, trained in endurance, tempered by war and loss, refused? She would not leave her husband, not even for death. And as she stayed by Arthur's side, she unknowingly shaped her destiny, a destiny that would lead her into the arms of another Tudor prince, a destiny that would place her on the throne of England, a destiny that would end with her discarded by the boy she tried to raise as a husband. Sweat was not the only sickness rising that week. Another disease was being born, a genetic obsession, a hunger for sons, a fear of extinction that would consume Henry VIII for the rest of his life. Arthur's breathing grew shallow. His skin turned a sickly gray. The sweating slowed, never a good sign. The sweat did not fade because the body recovered. It faded because the body was giving up, exhausted, spent too weak to even scream. Outside Arthur's chamber, the political world began to move. Whispers ran through the corridors. If Arthur dies, who inherits? Is young Henry ready? What will the king do? What will Spain demand? What will France think? Is the Tudor dynasty already falling apart? Messenger boys galloped in and out of the castle, boots pounding on stone faces, pale, carrying letters that grew more desperate by the hour. Henry VII began drafting contingencies, backup marriage contracts, financial protections, revised alliances, routes of escape if everything fell apart. He had raised Arthur trained. Arthur built the Tudor image around Arthur. Henry VIII was never meant to be king. He had been raised as the spare educated for church. Not court for books, not battles for a life of comfort, not responsibility. The death of Arthur would not simply alter politics. It would mutate the soul of the Tudor dynasty. Because while Arthur was trained to rule with discipline, Henry VIII was trained without boundaries. Arthur learned responsibility. Henry learned indulgence. One was shaped for the crown. The other was shaped by freedom. The sweat had infected more than Arthur's body. It infected the entire future of England. On the 6th day, April 2nd, Arthur Tudor knew it was over. There is a way the dying look at the world when they recognize the end. His eyes stopped focusing. His hands stopped gripping Catherine's. His fingers, once clinging, fell limp against the sheets. His lips moved, but no sound came, as if whatever he meant to say belonged to another world now. He looked upward toward the beams of the ceiling, as if waiting for something, for judgment, for release, for God. Then silence. A silence so heavy that Catherine felt the air itself collapse. She pressed her cheek to his chest. No heartbeat. The air was gone. The Tudor future was gone. The entire fabric of English history shifted in that moment, quietly and visibly, like a fault line splitting beneath the earth. Catherine fainted. Servants screamed. Priests rushed in with holy water and whispered Latin. And far away, Henry VII sank into a chair, hands shaking, eyes hollow, because he knew this death would haunt England for centuries. In the weeks after Arthur's death, Henry VII changed. He became colder, harder, more paranoid, more controlling, more obsessed with wealth, order, and heirs. England had nearly destroyed him once in the Wars of the Roses. Arthur had been his shield against chaos, the symbol that everything had been worth it. Now the shield is gone. Henry VII became the king history rarely talks about, not the triumphant founder, but the grieving father whose sorrow hardened into policy. A man whose grief rewired his reign. He tightened taxes. He imprisoned rivals. He hoarded gold as if it could buy protection from fate itself. He watched his younger son with an intensity that bordered on fear. Because Henry VIII was now the single thread holding the Tudor dynasty together. If he broke, England would collapse. This unspoken terror, this choking fear of extinction, became the inheritance Henry VII passed down to his surviving son. And Henry VIII inherited it fully. He was only 10 when Arthur died. He watched his father unravel. He watched the palace tense like a fist. He watched servants step more quietly. Nobles speak more carefully. Courtiers weigh every word. He learned a lesson that would define his reign. A king is nothing without a male heir. And a queen is nothing if she fails to give him one. This was the seed of every execution that followed. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. All their tragedies began the night Arthur died. Here is the truth, hidden in plain sight. Henry VIII was not born a tyrant. He was shaped by grief that wasn't even his own. His father's fear became his obsession. His brother's death became his legacy. His mother's quiet sadness became his inheritance. Every time his wives failed to produce a son, Henry VIII wasn't simply angry about the failure. He was terrified of Arthur's ghost, terrified of seeing England collapse, terrified of watching his dynasty disappear, terrified of losing everything because fate had already taken one Tudor prince. Arthur's death created the most violent, most transformative, most consequential monarch England ever produced. And the ripples of that 6-day fever still shape the world today in churches, in laws, and the very idea of what it means for a crown to sit on a human head. Arthur Tudor was buried quietly, without the majesty expected for a future king. The cortege moved through Worcester like a shadow, with mourners whispering prayers instead of singing hymns. Henry VII did not attend. He claimed illness. But many believed he simply could not bear the sight of the coffin that carried his hopes, his legacy, his peace of mind. Catherine of Aragon was kept away, too isolated, trembling, unsure of her future, unsure whether she would be sent back to Spain or remarried to Arthur's younger brother. The world had shifted. Everyone felt it. But no one knew yet just how violently that shift would reshape centuries. In those early days of mourning, there were no prophecies of Henry VIII's tyranny, no whispers of 6 wives, no hint of the English Reformation. But the seeds were there, buried beneath the grief. Because Arthur's death didn't just rob England of a king. It robbed England of the king it needed. And it replaced him with the king England would come to fear. For Henry VIII, Arthur's death carved something into him that never healed. People later said Henry VIII's obsession with male heirs was born from arrogance, lust, pride, ego. But the truth is darker. He grew up watching his father unravel. He watched the kingdom tighten like a drum. He learned that a prince's life was not a blessing. It was a burden. When Catherine of Aragon failed to give him a surviving son, Henry VIII did not simply feel disappointed. He felt cursed. He felt the ghost of his brother sitting beside him, reminding him, "You were never meant to be king." Every miscarriage echoed Arthur's final breath. Every stillborn child smelled faintly of the sweat-soaked sheets of Ludlow Castle. Every wife who failed him became another chapter in a story written 6 days before Henry VIII understood what fear was. Arthur's death turned Henry VIII into a man who could not tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity, or the fragility of life. It turned him into a king who would rather bathe England in blood than let the Tudor dynasty crumble again. This is the irony hidden beneath the triumphs and tragedies of the Tudor age. Sweating sickness did not just kill Arthur. It infected everything that came after. It infected Henry VII with paranoia. It infected Henry VIII with obsession. It infected England with instability. It infected Europe with religious upheaval. It infected 6 queens with fear for their lives. It infected generations with the belief that a woman's worth was measured by her womb. Arthur's death was a disease that outlived the body it consumed. A sickness of the crown, a sickness of the soul, a sickness that reshaped a nation. If Arthur had lived even for a few more years, would England still be torn from Rome? Would 6 queens suffer under Henry VIII? Would Anne Boleyn lose her head? Would Elizabeth never sit on the throne? Would the Anglican Church even exist? Or would history be quieter, gentler, calmer, guided by a king raised for duty, instead of a king raised by fear? Was Arthur Tudor's death a tragedy of fate or the first domino in a chain reaction that changed the Western world? And here's the question that haunts every historian. Did England gain more from Arthur's death, or lose more than it ever understood. If this story changed the way you see history, if it made you rethink the Tudors, the Reformation, or the nature of destiny, tell me in the comments below. Would Arthur Tudor have been the king England needed? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, because history is full of quiet deaths that reshape empires. And sometimes the most powerful kings are the ones who never lived long enough to wear the crown.